Alright, so this is interview number 3. It's the 29th of October 2008. We're interviewing Golda again, Henning, Serena, and myself. Alright, so Helena. So basically, we just wanted to hear a little bit more about the whole liberation, because we know you were in Bergen-Belsen and then it was liberated by the British, so maybe just more about what a typical day was like during the liberation, what life was like.
Once we were liberated, once I realized that we were liberated, I think I mentioned that still it was in some respects a sad occasion, because intuitively I knew that most of my family did not survive. I didn't know exactly who didn't, but we just knew that we realized that most of them had not survived. And I also think I mentioned that previously, that the British, once they liberated Bergen-Belsen, people were so sick and the place was so dirty, full of lice and disease, that they started to throw DDT, which is outlawed now, to kill, I guess, some of the bacteria and some of the lice. And these shacks that we were living in, they actually transferred us. They took most of the people out of there. It probably took a few weeks for this to be accomplished. But they took us out of there and settled all the people in some housing which had been, during the war, it was housing for the German soldiers. And these were decent little apartments where they settled everyone. And some of the sick people, those that they thought have a chance, I suppose, to be cured, they took by ambulance to a makeshift hospital. There were no hospitals really in Bergen-Belsen, and this makeshift hospital that they took the people to, it was still in Bergen-Belsen. They had converted, I guess, one of these apartments into a hospital. There were some nurses and some doctors, and one of the sick people that they took by ambulance, I think I mentioned that before, was my mother. And my sister insisted that she has to go with my mother. They actually didn't allow it, but my sister was so insistent that they did allow her to go with my mother. And my middle sister and I, and a cousin of mine to whom we were very close and we were together, we remained in these little apartments. And actually that hospital was not more than maybe half a mile away from these apartments. It was close. Maybe it wasn't even that far, but we had no idea at first where the hospital was. Finally, when we found out more or less where it is, my sister and I and my cousin, we would just go around all these little apartments and call out, Irene, Irene, that's my sister's name, who had gone with my mother. And eventually my sister just looked out from one of the windows. She stuck her head out and looked out, and when we saw her, we recognized on her face that obviously that the news is not good, and we realized that my mother had probably passed away. And of course we all grieved for a long time. And but somehow life went on from there. liberated. So it meant that we were free, though everything, life was sort of on hold, but nevertheless people would occasionally take a bus and go in to one of the German cities to see a movie or to see a play, and sometimes even to see an opera. Most often we would go to Hamburg. I'm sure you're familiar with it, because it's actually pretty close from Bergen-Belsen. And we were...
what would you do when you went to Hamburg? You would go to the...
We would go to the movies, or...
Do you remember any movies that you saw?
That I don't remember any titles, but we did go several times.
Did you feel like you were doing things normally again, or getting in a rhythm, as if you were kind of feeling like yourself again in some way by doing things like this?
In some way, life was, well, shall we say, a lot more normal than before the liberation, but we knew that we have to wait around until some country would let us in. Israel was not a state yet, so we couldn't go to Israel, though some people did go. It wasn't legal, but somehow they were smuggled into Israel before Israel became a state. And
did you want to go to Israel? Did you think that, did you have a particular country you would prefer?
actually, my middle sister and I would have wanted very much to go to Israel, but we had started to receive letters from some of our friends who had gone to Israel and described life as being very hard. So my older sister, more or less being responsible for us, refused to go to Israel, but then we had hopes that we would be able to go to the United States. And indeed, in 1949 there was a quota. The United States let in 100,000 displaced persons, and my two sisters and I were among those people that came to the United States.
Okay, before we get to the United States, I'm just curious, when you were during the liberation time in Bergen-Belsen, did you take classes or anything? Did you take classes or go to school at all? What did you do during the days?
Things more or less were normal. A school formed, and children of actually all ages were thrown together into one class, and from age 8 to whatever, people were in one class, and then there was a higher class where my middle sister, for example, went. And some of the teachers were survivors, let's say, from Poland, who had been teachers before the war, so they now volunteered to teach in that school. Some were teachers from different countries, not only from Poland. Eventually some Israelis came in, and some of them taught. So it was more or less normal. It wasn't like you went from class A to class B. We just studied. If some teachers, let's say, taught in Polish, some in Hebrew, it was sort of a mixture of it's a mixed situation. Whatever one could teach, that's what they taught. Nevertheless, we gained quite a bit.
Did you know Hebrew at this time? Did you take classes?
Once the Israelis came in, they started to teach Hebrew, and in fact, at that point, all the subjects were taught in Hebrew because they took a lot of the classes over, and some of the survivors also knew Hebrew, so we were not even allowed to talk any other language other than Hebrew. There was a penalty of some, I don't remember how much money, that we had to pay if one spoke Yiddish or Polish. So actually my classmates and I, we spoke Hebrew quite well. We spoke Hebrew and we understood quite a bit. We could express ourselves quite well.
And you didn't start to, did you learn English before you came to the United States or not until you got here?
No, I didn't know any English before I came to the United States. In fact, we arrived by ship in Boston, and by train we went to, of all places, to Baltimore. That's where we were sent. One could not pick a city where one wanted to go because many newcomers were coming in, and the Jewish organizations divided these groups so that no particular city would be overwhelmed with thousands and thousands of newcomers. So we were sent to Baltimore, and
do you remember your first impressions of coming here?
yes, more or less I do. On the train I felt very strange, and in fact this is sort of comical. I had to go to the bathroom, and there was somehow there were a lot of English people on the train. I guess it must have been a normal train of people going from Boston to Baltimore. My older sister knew some English, and I said, how can I go to the bathroom? This man is in the way. So my sister said, go over there and just say, excuse me. And I went over and I said, excuse me, and when the man moved, I was shocked that I actually uttered an English word and he understood what I said. It was really funny. And then once we arrived in Baltimore, I guess they didn't at first have where to put this group of people, so we were settled somehow for a few nights. It must have been, I think, a nursing home or an old age home. And when I realized how old and sick these people are, it was actually a very depressing, situation. But it wasn't long after that each of us was assigned a social worker, and these social workers started to work with us. They arranged for my older sister, who was a dental technician, to find work. They found an apartment for us. They saw to it that I was registered in school and started to go to school. They were really wonderful to us, very helpful, and many of them fortunately spoke Yiddish, and that's how we could communicate, because we didn't, my sister spoke a little bit of English, but I didn't, and my middle sister didn't speak any English, but since most of them understood Yiddish, so we were able that way to communicate. And eventually my older sister was married to a man from New York.
How long had she been here before she got married?
2-3 years, I'm not really sure, but somehow there was communication. She would sometimes go to New York, and people from New York would visit, and she met this man, and I guess they fell in love, and she was married and moved to New York. And my middle sister actually also moved to New York because we had a cousin who now lived in New York, and my middle sister went to live with her and was going to college there in New York.
So what was it like to go to school here when you started? Were you in school with mostly Americans, or?
Yes,
So what was
these were
that experience
American
like?
children, and one of the teachers actually assigned a student to me because they realized that I didn't speak any English, for the student to sort of help me out. She was really very helpful. And some of the students actually despised me just
Right.
because I was foreign and didn't speak English, and some were actually extremely nice for the very same reason.
Did they all know where you were coming from and what you had been through?
I
Did you have
don't
to
know
tell
if they
them,
knew
or?
what country I came from, but they all knew that I was foreign. That was very obvious by the way I was dressed, and I hardly spoke any English, but it took about 3 or 4 months, and then I could express myself quite well. I studied very hard, but I could express myself quite well. And one of the young girls that was so extremely nice to me invited me to her house after school, and when I came over there, I met her mother, who served us milk and cookies, and I was like so shocked because I didn't realize anymore that children my age somehow have parents, and I was like completely taken aback by that, and it dawned on me then what I have lost, that I have no parents, that life is really not normal for me.
So how did you, how did you cope with that? Like how
did I cope with it? It was hard to cope with it. I thought of it, and very often I was depressed, but nevertheless I tried to go to school, to study, to do well. And as I mentioned, my oldest sister had gotten married to a man from New York, but I had to finish a semester in Baltimore, so I remained in that apartment by myself. And that was a very sad period because I was really all alone. And actually there was a family across the street, also newcomers, and I don't know how they got to know me, but I guess they must have had a lot of pity on me, and they very often would invite me to their house and sometimes ask me to sleep over there, and that was a rather pleasant situation, though these were married people, a lot older than I, but still I realized that this is a family that liked me, and suddenly I had some friends. But after a few months, when I finished my semester, my sister urged me to come and live with her in New York, because obviously in Baltimore I was all alone. And yes.
Before we get to New York, did you ever go to synagogue in Baltimore when you first got here?
I went once or twice, but again it was a very strange sort of feeling because I knew no one, and it wasn't that pleasant an experience somehow for me.
So were you still keeping kosher and things? Like were you still
no.
living? No.
Once after the liberation, for a long time I did not keep kosher, no.
Why is that?
For me,
is that?
Why is that? First of all, my sisters didn't, and I lived with them. It would have been impossible. And frankly, I just didn't give it any thought. I somehow had survived the war, and obviously there was no consideration for kosher in the camp, and that I just didn't think about it, frankly.
Do you remember where in Baltimore you lived? Like, or where you went to school here? Just,
Maybe
I
just
did
technical
remember
questions.
the name of the school. I actually went to visit it, but the school
Yeah.
was closed. It's possible. Is there such a thing as Central High School?
yeah.
Yeah, here's there, Central High School.
And the street that I lived on in Baltimore, I do remember the name of the street. It was called White Luck Street.
White Lux?
White Luck.
Oh.
And actually we had an apartment there. It wasn't an apartment, our own apartment. We lived with a family, but we had like our bedroom and a little living room that they had rented to us, and we had kitchen privileges. And I even remember the name of the people. Their last name was Budlow.
Hello.
All right.
Do you remember like any activities you did besides school here in Baltimore? Did you see the area, or did you visit anything?
There were some newcomers. Actually, I didn't know any females. Somehow there weren't any my age, but there were some boys my age, and we would sometimes get together a little bit.
And how old were you at this point? How old were you around this time? You were in Baltimore?
Must have been already around close to 18 or so. And so, to go back, I eventually moved to New York, but now I lived with my married sister. And that too, though I was treated extremely well, but I sort of felt, how should I say, very much out of place, because I realized that I'm living with a sister, not with my parents, and I knew that she had just been married. And I thought to myself, well, how can my brother-in-law like this situation? He absolutely never mistreated me. But still I felt very much out of place. And because of it, since he was working and my sister was working, and they were not doing financially well, because this was the very beginning when they had come to the United States. So I really tried very hard to help out with, I would sometimes cook, and I would clean, and I would shop for the groceries. I tried to at least make myself useful, but my life was very hard at this point in New York, because I was also going to high school, and I knew that I will be graduating soon, and that somehow I have to go out and do something to make a living. And I knew that I very much disliked the idea of being a secretary. I just disliked typing, and I didn't like to do that. Well, my middle sister had actually gone to a school, a private school, to become a medical technician, a lab technician, you know, where you take blood and cardiograms and urinalysis. and that idea sort of appealed to me. So though I was still in high school, I started to go to night school, to one of those schools. I should also mention that it was a fairly expensive school, and I had a very hard time convincing my social worker and the organization that she belonged to that they should pay for the school. They told me that once I moved to New York, that's probably where I would have to apply. But I told them New York is such a big city, and I knew that there were so many newcomers, and somehow they relented and paid for that school. And at first I actually kept it a secret from my high school teachers and advisors, because officially you are not allowed to do that. You are not allowed to go to high school and go to night school at the same time. But somehow, I don't know how they found out, and they were completely sympathetic. They let me go and finish, and once I did finish, I did indeed get a job in that line.
So where was your first job? Do you remember?
My first job actually was for a doctor in New York, whose name I don't remember. I only worked there a few weeks. But I should add here that by this time my middle sister was married, and she had married someone from Chicago, so she moved to Chicago. And now she insisted that since I had been with my older sister for so long, and I have graduated from high school, that I should come to Chicago and she'll help me find a job. So indeed I did take a train, and I came to Chicago, and I got a job as a lab technician in Edgewater Hospital, and I worked there for quite a few months.
Edgewater Hospital?
Edgewater Hospital, it was called, yes.
So what was your job? You were a technician?
Pardon me?
You were a technician?
Right, a lab technician or medical technician, I don't know.
Do you remember any specifics at the hospital, like any specific times when you helped people or worked on certain...
What I worked on, or
Yeah, or any people who you helped in particular, or any...
Yes,
places?
well, my job was some days, let's say I would sit all day long in the lab and do blood counts, okay? Other days I would be on the floor and collect those blood specimens. There was someone in this lab who assigned every day. I wasn't the only person working there were quite a few women. And we were all assigned each day a job, what to do. Other days I would go out and push like one of those machines and take cardiograms all day long. So yes, that was my job.
Was it ever weird for you working in a hospital after, I don't know, everything you had been through in Europe, or?
No, because I looked at it, I really tried to help people, and in many cases I was really quite helpful. So I actually liked the job. It was hard work, but I liked the job. And after that job, I worked for a doctor in Chicago for quite a few months, and I remember his name. It was Weiss, Dr. Weiss I worked for.
So when you were living in Chicago, what was sort of your daily life like? So you went to work and you lived with your sister?
Well, you say what was daily life like?
Daily life.
Well, again, I felt sort of out of place because I lived with a married sister and her husband, once again, I was absolutely never mistreated, but it was sort of generally a depressing situation for me, I would say, because now, since life was not on hold, I realized that that's it, that's my life. So I also knew that I had lost so many people in my family, and I knew that most people my age obviously are living with their parents. So I can't say that I was very happy. I was not. And eventually in Chicago I met my husband and was married.
How did you meet your husband?
How did I meet my husband? Well, we will make it very short.
Oh, take your time.
Actually, one of my teachers in Bergen-Belsen, when I was still in camp, who taught Hebrew, also came to the United States, and he was a principal in one of the synagogues where my husband was a cantor at that time. And since obviously my husband was single and he knew him, and he knew me, and he knew my sister very well. In fact, my sister and her husband used to meet with him, and his wife, they used to meet socially. So he suggested to my sister and to my husband that we meet.
So he set you up.
Set up.
That meeting was arranged. And
Do you remember your first date?
yes, I do. I think we went somewhere it was actually shortly before Christmas, and we went somewhere to a museum, and it was sort of interesting to see all the Christmas trees, how beautifully they were decorated, and the lights, and the downtown. I mean, everything was so beautifully decorated. I was rather impressed.
So did you sort of have to fill him in on your whole, like, did you feel compelled to tell him, like, everything you'd been through when you met him, or, I mean, was that?
No, it actually took a very long time. I usually didn't, I mean, obviously he knew that I'm a Holocaust survivor, but here and there I would, like, tell him a snitch, I generally did not talk about it until once he read I think he might have mentioned that to you, he read an article in the Reader's Digest about somebody's life during the Holocaust, and he thought to himself, gee, my story is so much more interesting, has so many more facets to it, and he started to urge me to tell him the story. He wanted to write it. Well, actually I was very much against it, because he was busy at the time. He was working on his doctorate degree. He was going to Northwestern University in Chicago, and he was working. I really didn't want to tell the story, and I didn't want him to take the time, but he was really very adamant, and he said, every night let's just talk a little bit, and he would write everything down, and eventually he thinks that I didn't completely remember. Some things were sort of fuzzy in my mind, so he interviewed my two sisters. They were a little older, and two men that were quite a bit older even than my sisters from my town who had survived, and he interviewed a cousin and eventually just put the book together.
Did it help to talk about it, to say it out loud, things that you hadn't really talked about before?
Did it help while I was talking at times?
Well, did it like help you to say things out loud? Because I know sometimes people keep things inside and then saying them.
It was extremely hard to talk about it actually, and when he interviewed, especially for example my middle sister, she would very often break down. When he couldn't continue, he would have to continue another time. But eventually, once somehow the book was written, I feel that it did help, yes. Somehow, once the book was written and I read it, and they started to call me, there's a Holocaust center, for example, in the Detroit area. Once we moved to Detroit, they started to call me to talk to people that came to visit the Holocaust. I felt that it served the healing process.
How long did it take from meeting your husband and starting working on the book? How much time? When did you get married?
In 1954. And the book was, when was it published? Somewhere in the back, if you take a look. In other words, it took a lot of years before the book was actually published. It's probably somewhere there.
Did you feel, when you got married, how did that help you feel more like you had a family again? Like
you were in a place.
In a better place, because you had that support system that was your own?
Yes, in many respects, yes, because I now had my own home, my own apartment, but still, especially after our first child was born, and our daughter was born a year after we were married. At that point, somehow, I really did miss my parents. I really felt, gee, I have no parents, no aunts, no cousins, except one cousin who lived in New York. And somehow the realization then really hit that how much I had lost. And also at that time, as I mentioned, when I went to visit my girlfriend and her mother served us milk and cookies, it was almost like a shocking experience, which is sort of hard to understand. But I realized, oh my, there are mothers and the children come home and there is somebody home and they are served milk and cookies, and that was somehow a very overwhelming experience.
So did you do anything to sort of fill in that void, or was there anything that you did to sort of...
There wasn't really much that I could do, but I somehow did have the sense, though, that I had to go on. And I did. And especially once, like I said, I was married and we had our own apartment, and then we had a second daughter 3.5 years later, and things more or less normalized.
So what did it feel like to be a mother after not having had your mother in such a long time? What did it feel like when you were a mother?
Well, I definitely tried to do the best for my children, but just because I didn't have a mother doesn't mean that I was very permissive. No, I wasn't. Obviously, we both loved our children, but neither one of us particularly spoiled them. We were not terribly permissive.
And just so I can write it down again, what are your daughters' names?
The older one is Ruth,
Mm-hmm.
and the younger one is Vivian. Ruth lives in Baltimore, Vivian lives in New York.
Do you like realize any differences in like how you raised your children and your husband did, like from the different cultural backgrounds? Or did you see like still elements like how you were raised, or?
Actually, there wasn't much difference, even though my husband was born in the United States. He was born in Dallas, Texas. But his parents came from Europe. So our backgrounds were somehow not that much different.
Where in Europe were his parents from?
Pardon me?
Where were his parents from?
They were both from Russia.
And so you mentioned that your husband was a cantor when you met him. So did you all of a sudden did religion start becoming like more?
Well, I started to think about it. His parents were religious, and so was he. And it's at that point that I really started to think about it, and I really knew that I would like to go back to religion.
Did you have an intention of raising your children Jewish
Oh yes.
and Orthodox?
Yes, definitely.
So what was it that sort of made you want to go back to being religious the most? Like,
What made me want to go back to it, you asked?
to make it.
Well, I had been brought up in a very religious house, and somehow once I met my husband and his parents, and I saw what the holidays were like, and what the synagogue meant to them, and what religion meant to them. It sort of brought back memories from my own childhood, and I definitely wanted to go back to it.
What other activities did you do, or like in your free time with your husband? Like, what did you like to do when you didn't work?
You mean once I was married?
Yeah, with your children, and what were you interested in?
Well, we took the children to all kinds of places, wherever we took children, wherever one takes children, you know. Sometimes to Kiddieland, to the park, picnics. I mean, we did all the things that other people did, and obviously we also had friends, you know. Slowly we had a lot of friends, so we would often meet. They would come to our house, we would go to their houses. Eventually also these people that we had that were survivors, because no one had family, we formed like a club, and we would meet once a month, because no one had family. So all these...
In Chicago?
Pardon me?
In Chicago?
In Chicago, right. What did we call this family club? I forgot what United Family Club, we called it.
That's very nice.
And these people that met, they were all survivors, except that here and there a spouse was not. Let's say my husband was not a survivor. Other people met, also Americans, and they were married to people born here, but most of us were survivors.
Did you guys have Shabbat together ever, or any holidays within the people in your club?
Not with the people in the club, but surely with family, yes. yes, his family, we would meet often. Uh, let's say during holidays, my sister that lived in Chicago, later my other sister moved to Chicago too, the one from New York. So sure, we would either spend the day together, either we would go to their house or they would come to our house. We would very often meet, and my sisters had children too, so now my children had cousins. So the children met very often, played together, sometimes fought, no different than children here.
Do you have any specific memories of any holidays that you guys had as a family?
Oh, well, especially during, let's say, Passover. So, you know, there is like a Seder, so very often we would all be together. Most of the time they would actually come to our house because when my husband's father was still alive, so he would conduct the Seder. Once he passed away, my husband would. So most of the time we met at our house, but other holidays we would meet at their house.
When did you move to Michigan?
Well, more like 30 years ago, a little bit more than that. My husband, as I mentioned, was going to Northwestern University, and once he finished his degree, once he had his PhD in music theory, he got a job in Ypsilanti. Have you ever heard of Ypsilanti? It's like 12 miles from Ann Arbor. And he taught there for about 30 years until he retired.
So you left behind your sisters in Chicago at this point?
Eventually, when we left Chicago, and again, that was not a very happy period, but my husband had just finished his degree and couldn't find a job very easily in Chicago because he had no experience. And there was this job opening in Ypsilanti in his field. And so at that point, yes, I left my sisters, and my husband's parents were still alive, and we left them.
And what were your thoughts about that at the time?
I wasn't very happy about it, to say the least, but we would go in from time to time to Chicago to see my sisters and my husband's parents. My husband's parents would very often come to visit us, especially for holidays, and once they came, I would often encourage them, and they would stay 5 or 6 weeks at a time once they would come to visit. And my sisters used to come to visit too.
So Ypsilanti?
Ypsilanti.
Is that a city or?
It's a city.
Okay.
Yeah, it's 12 miles.
And he
from
taught
Ann
at a
Arbor.
university there? Or?
Yes, he taught at Eastern Michigan University. It's a state university, quite a large one too.
And do you remember any time your children started to ask like where you're from, like, or like about your background, or like did they understand that you're from Poland, or like did you talk about it when they were like younger, or?
Well, they always knew that I had an accent. I mean, once they were a few years old, they knew. So I must have at one point told them that, you know, I'm not born here. You know, that I was not born here, and that's where my accent.
But do you remember when you told them the whole story, or like what happened to you before?
I never really sat down to tell them the whole story. But once this book was written, they just read it, and then they would ask me questions.
Right.
And I know during the last couple interviews you said that you've had,
I'm sorry, but I
I
couldn't.
know during the couple times we've met, you've mentioned that you've had sort of lots of nightmares and things like that. I mean, has that been going on since you
Well,
left?
that unfortunately, you see, I think I mentioned to you that at one point I did have to have psychiatric help. A psychiatrist was helping me, and also a psychologist was helping me. And till today, I'm actually on a small amount of medicine. But as you see, obviously I function. But that doesn't mean that here and there, till today, I don't have a nightmare. I will dream about something in the camp. What I cannot understand is what I dream about might be something that I never even survived. It's just something that I heard maybe from someone else, and I will dream about it.
Like the fear of if that happened to you.
I don't know how this somehow combines that I would dream about something that I did not survive. Occasionally I'll dream about something that I survived. But other times it's something that I never saw, didn't survive, but just heard from other people, and that's what I'll dream about.
Would you ever talk about this with your sisters, or did you talk about it with anybody? Like, did it...
My sisters, till today, generally, we don't talk a lot about the camp. Till today, occasionally, we will say something, or if I want them to remind me of something, I will mention something, but we will speak about one incident and no more. For some or other reason, it remains a very, very unpleasant subject. They don't talk about it, and I don't talk about it.
Do you ever talk about the time before the war started, when you were all kids living with your
Yes,
family?
occasionally we will talk about it, yes,
Now,
with my sisters.
I know that you went back to Poland and you went back to Auschwitz.
Yes.
When did that happen?
Or how did you
did
decide to do that?
How many years ago was that? I'm not sure exactly what year that was.
Was it your decision to go back?
Yes, I definitely wanted to go back. And
Why?
why? First of all, my mother, who actually died 4 weeks or so after the war, is buried in Bergen-Belsen, and I definitely wanted to visit that grave. Secondly, though I knew that the people who sheltered me in Poland were not alive, the two original people, still I wanted to go back and visit the household and visit this woman who was then not much older than I was. I wanted to visit her, see the household, visit my town where I was born, and all of that actually did take place. We did visit Auschwitz, and that was very hard, particularly that somehow I was able to, how should I say that, I was able to think about Auschwitz in a way, well, I'm on the other side of the fence. I can't break down. And I was able to cope. My older sister, however, broke down several times, and it was up to me and my husband to sort of support her. So that was a hard visit.
What was it like walking back through there as, I mean, older and after this happened? I mean, how?
I'm sorry, what was it like?
What was it like to walk through the camp?
Did it bring back smells or
Like
memories?
being older and after having raised your own kids?
Well, of
and-
course, obviously it brought back memories and a lot of sadness, but somehow I was able at that point to really cope well. When we were in Bozentin, that's where I was born, so actually we wanted to go into our house. I might have mentioned that before, I don't remember. But there was an elderly lady sitting there in the courtyard,
In your house?
and she didn't want to, in the courtyard of our house, she didn't want to let us into the house. She thought that we came to claim property. Well, we explained to her in Polish that we came strictly for nostalgic reasons. It still didn't help. She was still very much afraid. Fortunately, there was a young boy there. I think he was her grandson. He just said, "Come with us." And we went into the house. Actually, the house did not change an awful lot from, even though it's so many years ago that we lived there. None of our furniture was there. Everything was gone. But the house did not change an awful lot. We sat there for about an hour, and the people who lived there were actually very pleasant to us. And of course, for my husband, this was the first time that we saw the house. And like downstairs of us, there was a bakery which belonged to my grandfather. Somehow that we couldn't really see well. Part of it, I think, was closed, and we couldn't see that. And when we were in Świętomasz, that's where I was sheltered. So this young lady who occupies the house now took me back to the garden where she and another girl who worked there and we prepared vegetables for the market and fruits. She took me back there. She took me back to the stable where I was hidden actually there for 2 weeks. She took me back to the church where I used to go every day. I asked about the priest. I would have wanted to see him. Unfortunately, he was not alive anymore. And there was an organist, somebody who played the organ. I would have wanted to see him, and he was not alive. But nevertheless, all these places brought back a lot of memories. I don't know if you have time still or not.
Yeah, I think we have to
Anytime
change
you
that.
want
Did you go
to.
back to your father's flour mill?
Yes, and we went back to my father's flour mill. It was still, the communist regime had still not broken up. So I don't exactly
That's right,
know,
'cause you were-
pardon me?
That's right, okay, sorry.
It was sort of about to break up when we were in Poland. But the people, the workers there were very pleasant to us. They let us in, and the mill is still functioning. And it looked like it didn't change a bit from the time when my father owned it.
And you, when was your husband, your sister, and her husband, or who?
Pardon me?
Who went
To
with you?
Poland?
Like